Hello, Create Schools. Today I want to go over the very first topic in the containment policy in Chapter 5. This is the case study of the Korean War, which is between 1950 and 1953. So go ahead and get out a piece of paper, a pen, or a pencil, and write these notes down. Pause the video here if you need to still write these down. Okay, I want to just let you know again about this video I made called Containment Policy Explained. It should be there in my YouTube video. So if you're thinking, ooh, containment policy, I can't remember what that is, this is a very brief explanation of what it is. You really need to understand the containment policy in order to understand what's going on in all three of these case studies. So if you are not knowing what containment policy is, stop the video right now, leave it, go watch this other video, and then come back to where we are now. Everything makes a lot more sense if you understand why America was doing what they were doing. So I'll go ahead and start the Korean War. Okay, before we can really understand a war, you always need to understand what happened before the war, which set up why the war happened. And so the Korea, first it was ruled by Japan until 1945, and I'll show you a map shortly of where Korea is. And then in 1945 it was divided in half at the 38th parallel. So that's the 38th parallel of latitude, so 38 north latitude. And the north of it was communist, and the south of it was anti-communist. The guy in charge was not very democratic, but he was definitely anti-communist. And so this here is one of my absolute favorite political cartoons, and I always have lots and lots of discussions about it. So I want to show you right here some of the major aspects of it. Here we've got a gravestone of the League of Nations in memory of the League of Nations. She died of lack of exercising, facing wanton aggression. So if you go back to Chapter 2, if you don't remember about the League of Nations, watch my video on the League of Nations. And here it died, and mainly it ended and died with World War II. So here we have Truman, and this is the League of Nations. My students usually laugh because it looks like it's a wedding, and here is the bridegroom or bride, and here is the groom, and she is representing the League of Nations with her machine gun, and together Truman, the United States, and the United Nations are jumping over the United Nations is jumping over the League of Nations. I hope I didn't mess that up when I was saying. So we've got our United Nations, Truman jumping over the League of Nations. Now, in case you don't know, United Nations still exists today, and it actually is working very well, unlike the League of Nations. They learned from their failures and was able to make a good organization that basically everyone in the world is part of. And so together they are going, and they're showing how they are good and strong in the Korean War. So if you have not already written these notes, go ahead and pause now, and we'll go on to the next slide. So here we go. Here is our Korea. This is what Korea looks like, and it's right here on the bottom of China. And I'm noticing I didn't actually give you a full map of exactly where Korea is. So if you don't know where Korea is, go ahead and pause the video right now, get out of it, Google Korea, and look at it on a world map. But basically we've got Japan way up here, and here is Korea. Actually, not way up here, but over here. Here's Korea, and then there's a lot more over here. Here is the 38th parallel. It is divided where it divides Korea into North Korea and South Korea. Most of you guys know North Korea because North Korea is still communist. Kim Il-sung, he is the communist leader. He is the great-grandfather of the present ruler of North Korea, so it says an all-in-one family. And Syngman Rhee, he is the president of South Korea. These are two names that you really need to memorize. So go ahead and practice writing them over and over until you get them in your head. So Kim Il-sung is of the North and Syngman Rhee is of the South. Basically what happened is Kim Il-sung decided that he wanted all of Korea to be joined together under communist rule, and he comes in and invades South Korea. So here's your little arrows coming in, and here's Seoul, the capital of South Korea, and they take over every bit but here. And so the United States goes, oh no, we've got to work on containing communism. And he goes to the UN and says, okay, we need to help. And what's going on is the Soviets are not actually in the UN right now. They're actually, boycotting the United Nations at this time. And they're not there to say, no, we don't want to do anything. If you remember again back to the League of Nations, people could veto and say, no, we don't want it to happen. And there's some type of that going on also in the United Nations. But the Soviet Union was not there to say, hey, don't do that. And it was all a whole bunch of capitalists there. So they say, okay, we don't want the communists, we don't want the North Koreans to take over all of Korea. Go ahead and we'll back you up because they set the line at the 38th parallel, like I'd said previously. And so the United States basically heads the UN forces to help push the North Korean army back. Okay, so pause here and write all of that down, and I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so here is the U.S. pushing back. Now, do remember in the containment policy, what happens if you are already communist, you may stay communist. But if you are not communist, the United States is not going to let you turn into communist. So we have General MacArthur. That's another very, very important name. General MacArthur is in charge of the U.S., and they push back, but they push over the 38th parallel. Now, China's leader, Mao Zedong, said, do not go that far. If they do go that far, then China will join in with the North Koreans, because China is also communist and is still communist today, although their communist is very different than what North Korea practices. So MacArthur and Truman, they go a little too far, they push over, and so what happens is China sends a whole bunch of people called the People's Volunteers to help North Korea. Basically, they did this because they didn't like Americans, and they were also aided with modern tanks and planes from the USSR. And so then, a couple months later, so we have October 1950, and then we have January 51, they push back, and they pushed back just over the 38th parallel. And please keep in mind that the 38th parallel is the original border. Again, the 38th parallel, you really need to memorize that. So just go ahead and put that in your mind, because you will always need to know that while we are discussing Korea and for the test. So go ahead and copy those notes down. I'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so then they hang out at the 38th parallel, going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, on July 1953, an armistice is declared, and it ends the Korean War. And basically, all of that happening, basically, it ended the exact same way it began. The North is communist, and the South is capitalist. Okay, MacArthur, since he went too far and threatened the attack on China, they finally fired MacArthur and said, really, you've got to stop pushing back the 38th parallel. Actually, containment is fine. We just need to contain communism. We don't need to wipe out communism. Remember, again, it's back to the containment policy, where if you were already communist, you can remain communist. And so the war ends. So pause the video and go ahead and take these notes, and I'll move on to the next one. So this comes straight from your book, the online book, or the book that looks like the online book. And this, I want you to study this map. If you have this map in your head, it really makes it easy for you to understand the way that the Korean War works. Basically, North Korea takes over everything. The Americans push it all back. China joins. They push it just past over the 38th parallel. Then we've got 2 years that it just goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and then it finally ends. Okay? Basically, if you'd like to draw these pictures, it might be helpful in your notes. If you don't wish to, you don't have to. If you do wish to draw them, pause the video here. If not, I will go on to the next slide. So, the basic action of what happened is pretty easy to understand in the Korean War, but we want to know what was the results of the Korean War. Well, first of all, this is the first time that the Cold War became hot. Okay? And so with the Cold War, there was a lot of wars, let's call them proxy wars. So basically, the United States and Russia didn't fight this war. Basically, North Korea and South Korea fought this war. But the South Korean were basically represented by the United States, and the North Koreans were basically represented by by USSR. And so that's why it's called a proxy war. And so it was still fought between the two big powers, but under the guise of a different war. Over 30,000 Americans were killed, and more than 1.5 million South Koreans and 3.5 million North Koreans were killed. That is a lot of people killed. Although when I say that, then I see here a total 1.4 million here is what the book said. So these numbers, they differ a little bit, but that's a lot. That's civilians. These are soldiers. So these, the estimation of with the civilians is much larger from this source than this source. It's always hard to tell how many people were actually killed a lot of times. Soldiers are easier to keep track of, but maybe they're also prisoners of war. The UN actually gained some respect because it actually had a firm action. So unlike the League of Nations, that was always wishy-washy, wishy-washy, wishy-washy. Again, watch chapter 2 videos to understand if you are not clear. The UN actually took a stance, they followed through, and they actually won. Okay, so it is a victory for containment because they did contain communism. The next point says some believe that Americans were only using the UN. Yeah, that's, I mean, pretty much America was dominating the UN. But the UN also used America because the Americans are the ones mainly who fought, but there was also a lot of other countries that did help. So again, the Cold War is no longer just in Europe and Americas, it is now spread to Asia. Okay? Talked about this last point, and Americans paid a huge price. That's what also shows the American was willing to pay a huge price in order to contain communism. Okay, pause here and take these notes down, and we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, and then something called the arms race began. Basically, the USA and the USSR were developing big and bigger and more deadly weapons. They had lots of spies that were spying on each other. The whole James Bond comes from the Cold War, and so if you watch some of the older James Bonds, you can see how was kind of like with the Cold War. And there were two things they looked at, the quality and the quantity of weapons. The quality, who had the most sophisticated weapons, who has the first atomic bomb. America had the first atomic bomb in 1945, if you remember from chapter 4, between Yalta and Potsdam. The Americans developed their atomic bomb and then dropped it later on Japan in order to end World War II. We were told in America that the USSR was winning. I'm actually going to jump down here to quantity, and they're calling this a missile gap. In America, we were told that there was a missile gap, that the USSR had more, and that the USA needed to have more, make more and more and more and more weapons in order to catch up with the amount of weapons that the USSR had. But actually, this was a lie. America always had more weapons. And later, in 1960, Eisenhower learned that the missile gap was not true, but he didn't do anything because the informant who told him it wasn't true, he needed to protect his informant. And so America just came and made more and more weapons. This one is political cartoon. I put it here. It said, on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. Okay? And so they're here using less sophisticated weapons because if one person would drop a bomb, then the other person would also drop a bomb. And we will discuss that in just a second. Go ahead and pause the video here. Write down your notes for arm race, and then I'll talk a little bit more about this political cartoon in the next slide. Okay, so deterrence and MAD. MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. Okay, and so if we go, I'll just pop really quick back to this one. And so that's mutually assured destruction. If I was to use my bomb, they'll use their bomb, and then we will both be bombed and basically die. So by 1961, both of the superpowers could destroy each other many, many times. In fact, now we have enough weapons we can destroy the entire world many, many times. So basically, everyone lived in fear that there would be a nuclear war, but actually nobody wanted to have a nuclear war because if one person bombed, the other person would also be bombed. So there was always this kind of fear, and so basically all over the world people lived in fear that we would all bomb each other. And I like this political cartoon. It shows America and Russia. It says ready, steady, and then of course go. If we would actually fire, the starting pistol normally is what they use, but they've got that pistol facing, pointing at their heads, saying if they start the race, they basically actually kill each other or kill themselves. They know that if I do my bomb, they'll attack me back. So that is MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. And that is our last slide for this. So when you're ready, go ahead and pause here and take these notes down. If you have any questions, please let me know. Have a wonderful day.